This video is brought to you by The Wandering Tavern, the system-agnostic TTRPG whose Kickstarter campaign is live now from the same creative team that brought you Sky Zephyrs. The Wandering Tavern is a 150-page traveler's guide to an incredibly immersive floating TTRPG setting. How cool is that? And it's absolutely packed with 15 giant battle maps, 33 NPCs, 30 plot hooks, 6 new plug-and-play Zephyrs, tons of magical items, illegal trades, downtime games, unique mechanics, and just so much more. Whether you're starting a fresh campaign or already have an established world, The Wandering Tavern is designed to fit seamlessly into your games. They've even been hard at work on their own custom airship builder application for you to use to create your own airships exactly the way you want it and automatically generate a stat block for your custom ship. So go and support The Wandering Tavern on Kickstarter now using my link in the description and the pinned comment below. Since its release in August of 2023, Baldur's Gate has been a pretty dominant force not only in the world of Dungeons & Dragons, but also in gaming more broadly. And it's not really a surprise why. Not only is the game excellent, but Larian Studios bucked a trend in modern gaming, which has largely been to ship unfinished games and then fix them over time and load them up with microtransactions to nickel and dime their customers out of everything they've got in the name of endless profits. But I digress already. What Larian proved is that modern gaming deserves better than the status quo. They proved that there is an appetite for heavily story-driven RPG games and not just another installment of Call of Duty. No shade on Call of Duty, it's a fun game, but you get my point. They proved that a developer can take their time and release a thoughtful and polished game and be rewarded for it rather than the things that we've been fed in recent years. The point that I'm trying to get at is that when it comes to Baldur's Gate 3, there is a lot for players to latch onto and become captivated by, and that also leads to many questions about why the Dungeons & Dragons team can't just adopt many of the things that Baldur's Gate did and just make D&D quote-unquote better. And that is what I want to talk about. Both the design limitations and implications of Baldur's Gate versus the tabletop game, and why it's not nearly as easy as it might sound to just emulate the game. A few days ago on Reddit, I came across a thread entitled, "They could really scrap all their work and copy BG3. And this really got me thinking about, 1, whether this is actually the case, I don't think that it is, and 2, that there are probably a lot of people who do think that this is the case and may not necessarily appreciate the very real differences that exist in a video game and a physical tabletop game. I'm currently on a quest to hit 10,000 subscribers by the time that the revised 2024 D&D books release in September. So if you like what I do and want to help me reach that goal, a sub to the channel would really mean a lot. Shout out to all my members, Julian in the Champion tier, Jackal3 and Jumpy Sonic Bear in the Hero tier, and Julio, Siren XY, and Brain Laborks in the Warrior tier. I couldn't do this without any of you guys, so please click the join button to help me for as little as $1 per month to get early access to new videos, priority replies to comments, and just so much more. Thank you. I think the first thing that's really important to mention and remember, and I know that this is going to sound really stupid and obvious, but it's that Baldur's Gate is a video game. Believe me, I hear it. Random YouTuber discovers that a video game is in fact a video game, more at 11. What I'm getting at is that it's useful to consider that there is a fundamental difference between the way that we experience and consume the content of a video game and that of a physical tabletop game. When you sit down to play Baldur's Gate, it's largely going to be on your own terms. There is a multiplayer mode, sure, but from what I've been able to gather, most people are playing solo. What this means is that you get to play exactly the way that you want to. You can create whatever character you want to make without even having to think about what someone else might do. You can control your entire party in combat so you don't need to worry about playing with someone who isn't necessarily going to be optimizing their playstyle. There's no DM to contend with and dictate what you can or can't do. There's just you and the game. And the thing is, you're gonna have different expectations of the things that you can do or that are even possible in a video game versus the tabletop. Most people will implicitly understand the limitations that exist in a video game, so they don't bother trying to find ways around it, since most of the time, you can't. Either something was programmed in or it wasn't. The game has a defined set of rules that can't really be broken or bent in any way. The spell either works or it doesn't. There's not really an in-between. And again, people more or less implicitly understand this. So this leads to a game where you are essentially in control of every element of your fun, provided at least that you enjoy the game. The point that I'm trying to get at here is that when someone says something like BG3 is better than D&D or that Wizards of the Coast should just scrap all of their work and copy Baldur's Gate, it seems clear that they haven't really contextualized how dramatically different these two mediums are. And it shows. You absolutely might prefer playing one over the other, but to say that one is distinctly or objectively better than the other is a challenging statement. There's a lot of nuance here. Your preference for a system that exists in Baldur's Gate might be heavily influenced by the fact that you experienced it in video game format rather than on a tabletop. Or maybe the reason you enjoyed Baldur's Gate so much was because of the tabletop. You're finally getting to experience a truly immersive and interactive version of the physical game that you've been playing for years, and that's a pretty special experience. I know that was definitely the case for me to a large extent. Getting to experience all the spells and the combat and stories play out with brilliant acting was truly incredible, and I think emphasized by the fact that I was coming from the tabletop. The other thing that Baldur's Gate does that has really helped improve and streamline the experience of the game overall is that it's more or less eliminated all of the crunch that exists in 5e. Every time you need to make a roll in Baldur's Gate, all of the relevant modifiers are automatically applied. If someone in your party has guidance, no one needs to start frantically yelling it. The option just appears on screen. Measuring and calculating the damage of your fireballs is just a single click away and resolves in less than a second. It's also instantaneous and gratifying to watch as you see some element of the environment explode or your enemies catch fire and fall. All of the crunchiness of D&D being handled in the background without you having to think about it makes the game so much more visceral. It feels tangible and real as things are happening in nearly real time. So with all that general stuff out of the way, I did want to talk about a couple of the specific points that the person in the post made, and a few more that they didn't. We'll start off with resting. Short resting in Baldur's Gate functions very differently from a mechanical perspective than it does in 5th edition. While in 5e a short rest takes 1 hour, characters regain any abilities that recharge on a short rest, and they can roll hit dice to recover their hit points. In Baldur's Gate though the short rests appear to be instantaneous, 15 minutes of in-game time does actually pass, though there aren't all that many things that this matters for except for a few specific duration effects. The impact of it is less of a worry if you're going to be ambushed while you sit down for an hour and more about whether you just have a rest available. Which actually brings me to the next point. Short rests in Baldur's Gate are more of a resource. You can take 2 per day and characters can heal for half of their hit point maximum rounded down during a rest. There's no hit dice, you just heal, you get your stuff back and you keep on going. Even the Bard's Song of Rest feature has been changed to better support this more resource-like mechanic, allowing you to take a 3rd short rest in a day. This type of short rest works particularly well in a video game mostly because it's incredibly efficient. It's designed to allow you to quickly recuperate and just keep going. It incentivizes you to keep adventuring for as long as possible, as there really isn't a downside to not doing that. You don't need to worry about camp ambushes, there's no random encounters that are going to happen during your short rest, it's effectively instantaneous. Now, to this poster's credit, this one actually can translate reasonably well to the tabletop, depending at least on how you're running your game. This is one of those rules changes that doesn't necessarily have that much of a mechanical impact on the game. The bigger impact is more on narrative, though the rate at which you can reaccumulate resources is potentially altered. The biggest question that you'd have to ask yourself is really whether time pressure is a relevant factor in your campaign. If the answer is no and there is no ticking clock, then is there really a difference if a rest takes an hour or 15 minutes or even if it's instantaneous? If there is a ticking clock on the other hand, then maybe deciding to stop for an hour can actually be a pivotal decision that the party is going to have to make, and there can be a lot riding on it. The functional limit though of 2 rests per day can pose some unintended narrative issues in D&D though, such as if you did need an additional rest and you don't have it and it hasn't been long enough for you to take your long rest, so you're just kind of stuck standing around for a while, and that can be a little bit weird. It's definitely worth mentioning at this point that short rests is far from a novel idea. There's even an example of it present in the 2014 Dungeon Master's Guide. The Epic Heroism variant rule from Chapter 9 of the DMG allows for short rest to be 5 minutes and long rest to be an hour. Now, this obviously can have some significant ramifications on how your games play out. The book even specifically mentions how this will make spellcasting characters even more powerful. This might work very well in a particular type of campaign, but honestly, even just including the short rest element of it isn't that bad if your goal is to have things move a little bit quicker and time isn't that much of a factor in your games. And sure, there can be some small scale impacts of short rests like catnap not really working, but I mean, that's probably not a big deal anyway. To go to the other side of this discussion, there are some things in Baldur's Gate that I think work really well in a video game and would not translate well to the tabletop. Probably the biggest one would be the lack of attunement. Attunement exists in Dungeons & Dragons to essentially prevent players from all more or less being able to simultaneously benefit from some very powerful magic items by passing them around. It can also help to restrain the amount of power that certain magical objects can have, and to help make the focus of character growth on features and abilities rather than magic items. I won't say that the implementation of attunement in 5e is perfect, but it largely does its job. Attunement is actually one of the 3 rules specifically called out in the Dungeon Master's Guide that DMs should be extremely cautious of changing. Chapter 9 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, under the Creating New Character Options section, reads, "Beware of adding anything to your game that allows a character to concentrate on more than one effect at a time, use more than one reaction or bonus action per round, or attune to more than 3 magic items at a time. Rules and game elements that override the rules for concentration, reactions, bonus actions, and magic item attunement can seriously unbalance or overcomplicate your game." Funnily enough, Baldur's Gate actually violates 2 of these rules. The Thief subclass for Rogue grants a second bonus action, and then there's the lack of attunement itself. Well, I guess there technically is a limit. You're limited by the 8 gear slots that you have. This is one of the things that functions perfectly fine in a single player experience, where the primary goal is to really make you as the player feel like a literal god as you just annihilate everything into oblivion. It allows you to create some incredibly powerful combinations, since there's just so many possible combinations. One downside is that it can fairly easily lead to the best in slot trap that many different types of RPGs encounter, like Diablo, for example, where it isn't that hard to end up in a situation where there's no reason to put anything else in a particular slot because it's just so much better than any of the other options available. And at the tabletop, this isn't really a problem since the DM is more or less in control of the items that exist in the game. But in something like Baldur's Gate, where players can identify areas where certain items can be found or purchased or looted, it can end up leading to a situation where itemization is effectively solved, quote unquote. The whole attunement mechanic is probably something that deserves a video of its own, and I probably will do that at some point, but I do think that it serves a very functional purpose in a game like 5e, where a lot of campaigns do tend to be on the higher magic side of things, so creating some limit on the amount of powerful items that can be equipped at any given time is important to a cohesive and less intrusive game. One last change that I wanted to touch on are the implementations of some of the spellcasting rules introduced in Baldur's Gate 3. Now, I know that this is going to be a controversial topic, particularly for some commenters, so I'll just stress that I do think that any widespread changes to spellcasting would need to be accompanied by additional balance passes to keep things still somewhat restrained. Characters already feel incredibly powerful in 5e, we don't really need literal superheroes running around. Or maybe we do, that's for your table to decide. Anyway, this is essentially the exact opposite approach that they took in Baldur's Gate 3. And again, they don't really need to worry about it because the goal of the game is to have the player feel powerful and in control, and to learn the game quickly and understand how things work without needing to read hundreds of pages of text. The biggest example of this is the fact that the bonus action spell rule doesn't even exist in the game. I've mentioned this in the past, but I do actually think that there is a chance that this ends up being the rule in the revised 2024 Player's Handbook, but we'll just have to wait and see. Another change is that every class can use spell scrolls, and that the DC isn't determined by the scroll itself, but rather by a certain ability score that each class has had attributed as their spellcasting ability modifier. This is kind of a fun idea that does absolutely have the side effect of making spells both more potent and prevalent in your game, which is probably not what a lot of people are looking for. However, in a single player video game, it works. Because again, there's just no one to answer to, and there's no one else to invalidate. It's just you exercising your creativity to feel as powerful as possible. This is the exact same reason why being able to swap your prepared spells at any time just feels fine in Baldur's Gate. Who are you hurting? I will admit that it took me an embarrassingly long time to learn that though. I was probably like 75% of the way through my first playthrough when I accidentally hit the K key and my mind was blown. When it comes to 5e though, one of the things that just makes the game feel more tactile are the degrees of permanency of your choices. Even if it's just for a day, you can be rewarded for assessing your given situations and picking spells that are going to be the most appropriate. Everyone's had that moment of disappointment as they look down at their spell sheet only to realize that the exact spell that they needed right now, they didn't prepare that day. And as annoying as that can feel, it's also kind of part of the fun. While being able to change your spells at will in a video game makes some sense, since if they didn't, you could just long rest and swap it anyways, you do lose some of the impact of those choices. I think a lot of what the difference between the design philosophy of D&D and Baldur's Gate comes down to is exactly that last point. It's your choices. D&D wants to give you more meaningful and impactful choices, even if they sometimes come at the detriment of your character. Like if you forgot to prepare the right spell, or if you can't equip all the items that you want to because of lacking attunement slots, or even resting. Resting in 5e has a time associated with it because they want it to feel like an intentional choice. You need something, but there's a risk involved. They wanted you to have to stop and think before you did something. As great as Baldur's Gate 3 is, that just really isn't the goal of many of the mechanical changes to it. I will say that they did do a great job at providing meaningful choices in the form of story and dialogue, but it is decidedly lacking in other elements of the game. I'm not saying this as a bad thing or a criticism at all though. It's just a fundamental difference between how these two very similar but different games are designed. Let me know what your thoughts are on Baldur's Gate 3 and the differences between it and Dungeons & Dragons in the comments below. Subscribe to help me reach 10K by September, but otherwise, take care.